And I do care a lot about our grandson's future, and I think that's shared by virtually everyone here, because the world that we're seeing in the future as we're headed right now does not look very good from many perspectives. And that's why I've spent quite a few years, almost 10 years now, working with the Eat Lancet Commission to find a different pathway. Much of the work that I will describe was began with the first report that was published in 2019, and I'm co-chairing the second commission. This has it made it possible to bring together experts from not just nutrition, but agriculture, earth sciences, sociology, economics, many other perspectives and areas of expertise that are really essential to look at this challenge in a comprehensive way. Basically, how will we be able to feed what will be about 9.8 billion people by 2050 a diet that is both healthy and sustainable? That was a challenge for the first commission, and it really remains the challenge. Of course, on the climate side of it, we're not doing well at all. And I think I don't need to explain that to everyone here. There are people in Washington who you may have heard of who don't believe that this really exists or is a problem. But the underlying problem here is this is not a linear increase in global temperatures. It's not linear. And we're entering vicious circles, as you well know, your permafrost melting that releases methane, which speeds up the cycling. And the most recent years have been the hottest years. And of course, another manifestation we see at Boston, your forest burning and our summer skies have been pretty not very blue the last couple of summers. It's just one manifestation of the changes that are going on. Now, the greenhouse gas emissions are primarily coming from burning of fossil fuels, about 70%, but about a third or 30% are coming from the food systems, both by direct production and also by the cutting down of forests and losing carbon capture, but also then tilling up the land, which releases methane. And that's happening, of course, because of demand for greater food production, particularly increasing amounts of animal source foods. And as everyone knows here, and it's been a major topic, the global epidemic of obesity is affecting virtually every country in the world. At the top, the high-income countries, and at the bottom, the low and middle-income countries, where the rates of increases are actually greater than in the high-income countries. So there's a convergence developing here where this is an issue virtually everywhere. And of course, this is just the most visible part of the food problem. Diet quality independently has a very major impact on well-being. I won't go into the detail. Of course, what took us 3 or 4 years to come up with the first Eat Lancet report. But just very briefly, we started off by looking at what is a healthy diet. The goal was to feed everyone a healthy diet. But of course, when you start to dig deeply into that, you open all kinds of controversies. And it's been a challenge. While there's agreement it should be healthy, but what does that mean in terms of proportions of different components of the diet? And so we looked at 4 different layers of evidence, just starting with the composition of food, effects on risk factors, that data mostly coming from randomized studies of a few weeks looking at risk factors. That literature is well known to everyone here. Associations with disease in large cohort studies, and where we had them, the very few randomized trials. You've heard of Predamid, probably the most successful randomized trial that was really able to maintain adherence for an extended period of time. But even when we agree that something is of concern and should be reduced, still, where do you draw the line on the dose-response relationship for, say, red meat? Here is an example. For our report, we used the data the quantitative data from the Nurses' Health Study, Nurses' Health Study 2, and Health Professionals follow-up study, because at this point in time, we had over 13,000 incident cases, so it could give us pretty tight confidence intervals at different levels of intake of red meat. And even by the second quintile, we could see there was a significant increase in, doesn't look like it on this slide thanks to PowerPoint, but it was significant there at the second quintile compared to the first quintile. So we didn't want to recommend that amount, but a little bit arbitrarily, and almost always when you have a continuum where you draw cut points, it's going to be somewhat arbitrary. We cut it at half of that, which comes out to be about 14 grams of red meat per day, which is about one hamburger per week. Or if you like big 12-ounce steaks, about a 12-ounce steak for a celebratory event about once a month. We've recently updated that data, that analysis, again, combining our cohorts now with about 23,000 incident cases of type 2 diabetes. And we used a measurement error correction process here. That's the darker lines here with the green confidence intervals. And if anything, the association was a little bit stronger that we'll use in our updated report that comes out in October. But the basic point is that it essentially reproduced with a lot more data what we saw the first time. So we went through food group by food group, looking at this full range of different kinds of studies, and came up with the scientific targets, which we eventually called the planetary health diet. And here, looking at, as an example, 2,500 kilocalories per day. For grains, really the important point is that they be whole grains, ideally lower glycemic whole grains, and that's favored over potatoes because of better metabolic and health outcomes when we look at the epidemiologic data, but still modest amounts of potatoes, and in Africa, cassava could be there. Vegetables and fruits, amounts that are pretty familiar to there. For dairy, that is a really complex area because there's definitely positive health benefits and an important and a potentially important source of micronutrients, but also some adverse effects as intake starts to get higher. And so we set the level at about 1 serving a day, which is in the range where the middle of the range that we saw as to be compatible with good health. For red meat, again, as I mentioned, keeping that to about 1 serving per week. Poultry, somewhat better composition from a fatty acid standpoint, about twice a week. Eggs, a couple of a week, but fish twice a week. But really emphasizing plant sources of protein, such as dry beans, lentils, peas, soy, and nuts, and suggesting a diversity of those. And I think it really would be better if some soy was consumed in India and there was some more dry beans in China for several reasons. General diversity is good. For types of fat, emphasizing unsaturated plant oils and modest amounts, if any, of saturated fats, and of course, keeping added sugars low. That's about 5% of energy. So that's what we published. Afterwards, in looking at this, I realized that you could really boil this down to something very simple, which is 1 + 1, and it's hard to get much more simple than that. We call this a flexitarian diet overall, because you could be a vegan or you could be a vegetarian, but keeping animal source foods with some limit, which does come out to be about 1 serving of dairy a day, and then 1 serving of some other animal source protein per day, if you wanted to be an omnivore, with red meat being not more than about once per week. And of course, that's on a base of primarily nuts, soy, beans, fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and plant oils. So actually, I find that a pretty simple way, an easy perspective to think about what a menu might be for myself or someone else. And we did put this together partly because USDA had created a plate. We made an alternative plate here, again, emphasizing what I just described. And Canada looked at the same body of literature a couple of years later And not to anyone's surprise, I guess, if you really look seriously at the literature, you come out with something that is very, very similar. But I must say the Canadian plate looks much more beautiful than our plate did here. So you guys, whoever did it, did a nice job. And like we suggested, taking dairy out of there and considering it as one of the possible protein sources, but emphasizing healthy plant protein sources, whole grains, uh, plenty of fruits and vegetables. I'll just say a quick word about one of the big controversies that we have because our head of HHS, when we mean basically NIH, all the healthcare facilities and programs in the United States, RFK hates seed oils. And that also interfaces a lot with what's talked about in terms of ultra-processed foods, because ultra-processed foods often contain seed oils. And it's really a little bit hard to know where this came from, but one of the claims is that seed oils which are high in general in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, are therefore pro-inflammatory. And actually, the literature on this is more consistent than almost any other topic that I know in the biomedical literature. And consistent here, this is a meta-analysis from a few years ago. Out of 15 studies, none of them showed an increase in inflammatory factors, and several of them showed reductions in inflammatory factors. I won't go into the biology of this, but there are multiple pathways, basically, not just pathways that are related to inflammatory factors and anti-inflammatory factors. And the epidemiologic data are very strong here as well. This is looking at types of fat and total mortality in our combined cohorts. Here, after 30 years of follow-up, about 30,000 participants have died by this point in time. And we're looking here at different types of fat compared to the same number of calories from carbohydrate. And as you can see, the worst type of fat, not surprisingly here for total mortality, is trans fat, saturated fat, modestly but highly significantly related to increased mortality compared to carbohydrates isocalorically, and this would be the average carbohydrates in the US diet. Of course, the type of carbohydrate will influence what this looks like. Monounsaturates being inverse, and the really strongest association outside of trans fat is this very strong inverse association with polyunsaturated fat, which is in this case omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. We never called it seed oils, but this is basically seed oils in terms of what most of this is coming from. So the evidence that seed oils is bad for us, and we should, as Kennedy suggests, go back to beef tallow and lard and butter as the primary fats in the diet, is just, well, it's not making America healthy again. It would really be going backwards, when in fact coronary heart disease mortality in the 1950s and 60s was about 4 times higher than it is today. We've made huge progress in this area, and the change in the type of fat, I think, has been probably the most important contributor to that huge decline. Although that's been a topic of debate, it's clearly a major contributor. Having spent this several years up to publishing the 2019 report, we came up with this diet, and then we've had the opportunity of looking in our epidemiologic data and other data at how well adherence to this dietary pattern is related to health outcomes. And for this, we've gone back to our cohort studies, which are unique in many ways, but in particular, I think it's fair to say that these are the only large cohorts in the world that have repeatedly assessed diet over time. Basically, every 4 years, we have our participants complete a food frequency questionnaire that it's been continually tweaked a little bit along the way to account for various changes in the food supply. Basically, in the 1980s, low fat became the primary focus of nutritional advice. And so we had a lot of low fat products coming into the market that we captured with our dietary questionnaires. This is 121,000 women in the Nurses' Health Study, 52,000 men added in 1986, and then the next generation younger, 116,000 participants in the Nurses' Health Study too. As I noted here, and I just don't have time to mention everyone's name, this has been the work of many people from many disciplines. It's truly a multidisciplinary project, multi-generational project now, and has served as a platform for many different analyses. We published this analysis just about a year ago, looking at adherence to the planetary health dietary score that we created, basically scoring each person's diet for each questionnaire over the follow-up here. And by this time, over 54,000 participants had died. And again, that gave us a lot of precision. We could look at deciles instead of just quintiles with this amount of data. This is women at the top after adjustment for potential confounders, a very clear inverse relationship. For the highest decile, about a 30% lower risk of death, premature death. And I think the other really important point here, it's not all or nothing. It's just every step closer to better adherence with the planetary health diet was associated with a reduction in risk of death. And in men, we saw basically the same pattern as well, with about a 30% lower incidence of fatal outcome over the 30-year period. We then went back to look at the whole world, and using a database that we've updated recently in collaboration with colleagues at Oxford University, we scored the national diet of every country around the world. And as you can see, not surprisingly, around the Mediterranean, the blue color, those countries tended to have the best diets. Actually, interestingly, Iran came out to have a diet quality score that was really good. I've been there a couple times. I do have a little doubt about whether it's really that good. And Japan, Southeast Asia also look good. But some places in Africa actually had rather good diet quality, but in some of those places, there's just not enough food. And so infant malnutrition does remain a problem. Then we could take our relative risks from our cohort studies and apply them to the disease-specific causes of death for every country around the world that I just described, and calculate how much of overall mortality globally could be avoided potentially by adopting the planetary health diet. And we published that late last year in PNAS. And our estimate was about 27% of adult deaths could be avoided by global adoption of almost a perfect score, but we didn't insist on a perfect score, which would be 140. This was if everybody could get to 120. So the impact was big, 15 million deaths per year potentially avoided. And in the United States, our diet is a little bit less than average in terms of quality. So the estimate was about 31% of deaths in the United States could be avoided by adopting the planetary health diet, almost 1 million deaths per year. And this was adjusted for BMI. So to the extent that diet quality reduces BMI, that would add to this further. So in several ways, this is a conservative estimate because there is pretty good data that diet quality will improve BMI and reduce weight gain. We also went on to look at the impacts on environmental variables if people adopted a diet more in the direction of this predominantly plant-based diet. And in the United States, in the Nurses' Health Study, we used as the example, the top here quintile versus the bottom quintile of adherence was associated with about a 29% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. Now, this is 29% of the 30% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. So it's It's a modest but important part of the potential reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But if we don't do that and only reduce fossil fuel consumption to close to zero, we still would not stay within the Paris climate agreements. We really couldn't have a sustainable future. So this is a necessary, but certainly not a sufficient part of the strategy to stabilize climate change. Fertilizer use about 21% lower. But what's really important is that land use, where the food system is by far the major consumer of land use, that could be reduced by about 50%. And that's huge because we could reforest part of North America, in a pretty major part of North America, or we could use some of it for biofuels. There's a lot of things we could do with this reduction in land use for producing food, mainly to feed to animals, to then feed to people, and obviously in a very inefficient way. So this is really important, and some reduction in irrigation water itself. Well, that's a lot of numbers quickly, but to go back to on the ground, this is actually our family farm again, as it looks today. This is not what it looked like when I was growing up, which was small fields, hedgerows, great biodiversity. But this is what the whole Midwest looks like if you travel through it. It's corn, soy, corn, soy. And of all the corn produced in the Midwest, the numbers I was told, only about 3% is actually fed to people, that about 45% is fed to animals, about 35% for biofuels, and a little bit for manufacturing. So it's just troublesome to look at this. It's feeding a food system that's making us sick, also destroying the environment at the same time. It's hard to imagine a system that's more dysfunctional than what we've created. In the update of the Eat Lancet, we'll be paying more attention and we recognized traditional foods, the importance of traditional dietary patterns, but we'll emphasize that more in the upcoming version. As it turns out, our planetary health diet fits almost exactly with a traditional Mediterranean diet. And the fact that we can see in PREDIMED and other studies that traditional Mediterranean diet pattern is extremely healthy. That provides important support for the causality of this reduction in mortality that we see. But because we looked at this, not starting with a Mediterranean diet, but looking at the components, putting them together, and then ending up with a Mediterranean type pattern, it means we can look at other food cultures around the world and find that they, in most cases, come pretty close to what we've described as a traditional the planetary health diet. This is close to a traditional Vietnamese diet, but almost I should say, when we looked around the world, there was no country that came really close to the planetary health diet, because almost every national diet could be improved quite a bit. And of course, in much of Asia, a huge problem is the massive amount of white rice that's consumed, and often with a large amount of sodium at the same time. So we swapped in some brown rice there, and of course, we'd like to keep the sodium levels pretty low. This is a traditional West African diet. This is a peanut butter stew, lots of greens in African diets. And actually, that would make a wonderful meal just on its own, but you could add some traditional whole grains and legumes and a little fish if you wanted to. Here's an example from Costa Rica, where the traditional grain would be maize, and beans is a major protein source. So to go back to the goals of the Eat Lancet Commission, we did see that the most important way to provide the world with a healthy and sustainable diet would be the adoption of a largely healthy plant-based diet, which would look different in every country, again, allowing tremendous variety, but it also to really deal with all of the aspects of environmental change. We would also need to reduce food loss and waste and make our agricultural systems more efficient. But the most important, though, was the shift in dietary patterns. Just as a little reminder of what the world would look like if we looked at population, not land size, it would be something like this, projected for 2045, close to 2050. And we are devoting in the update quite a bit to justice. And that is a real issue. I think if you're familiar with the global debate about greenhouse gas emissions, the global south is pointing to us and Europe and saying, you guys created the problem by burning all the fossil fuels. But the same really applies to food as well. And from the food perspective, you guys have been eating all the beef, not all the beef, a huge part of the beef, a very disproportionate part of the beef, and dairy foods, which have the biggest environmental footprints. And that's really not just because that's also contributing to the climate change that we're experiencing, and we didn't cause the problem. So that's something that is, I think, no longer going to be acceptable to much of the world, and clearly a reason for instability and something that we are trying to address, even though it's not going to be an easy issue to solve, but at least has to be recognized. So to conclude, feeding what will be close to 10 billion people by 2050, a healthy diet within safe planetary boundaries is possible, and it would improve the health and well-being of billions of people worldwide. There's a tremendous win there. It could also allow us to pass on to our children a viable planet, but that also assumes near elimination of fossil fuel consumption. And it's not going to be easy. Everybody really is going to have to be part of the solution. So, thank you.
Will you take some questions? Super.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I am wondering if the Eatlands diet actually fulfill all the gaps or all the needs, I would say, on micronutrients, and I'm particularly concerned about calcium and vitamin D, because maybe it's my ignorance, but it doesn't look like to me that it would, but maybe it does.
Right. We did do a nutrient analysis that was in the first paper, and we've done it in more detail this time around too. And it does, it will. If you go much below about 2 servings of animal sources of food per day, you do potentially run into low vitamin D levels, vitamin B12 levels. Yeah, so I think we need to be aware of that. Issues have been raised around iron. And actually, the iron data, even accounting for bioavailability, looks good. But this does need to be looked at on a regional or national basis, because there's so much variability in absorption due to, in Africa, infectious diseases, reduced absorption. Malaria leads to iron losses as well when you get hemolysis. So this is something that does need to be monitored. And of course, the foods themselves vary greatly. The grains in parts of the world have less iron in them than in other places. But
so what is your perspective on supplementation? If the diet does not provide all the micronutrients, what is the perspective of Eatlands on the supplementation fortification?
Right. Yes, I think, and we do address that there's various strategies, and there's no single best strategy for everyone. Fortification has been a classical way that in public health that micronutrient deficiencies have been addressed. That iodine in many parts of the world is addressed by fortifying salt, and that's really pretty much solved iodine deficiency problems in many places. Some places are supplementing with selenium, but if you have a really subsistence agriculture, fortification doesn't work very well, because people are just eating their own food. You do need that sort of centralization for fortification to work as well. Biofortification is of interest, but for a limited number of nutrients at present, and that may be part of the solution for micronutrient deficiencies where some exist. Or to take supplements. I think in the United States, I think it makes sense for pretty much everybody to take a multi-mineral, multivitamin supplement. that it's some people say, oh, you should have to get it from food, but that's expensive. The multiple vitamin I buy it at a local drugstore is 9 cents a day. So you can't buy very much food for 9 cents a day. But I think in every context, you need to look very specifically at what the best strategy would be. Although, unless there are some problems with absorption or something like that, in general, we've looked at it by region, and this would, in the countries where there's real deficiencies, this diet would almost across the board improve micronutrient intake quite substantially compared to present, because a huge part of the world is eating not much more than a basic carbohydrate staple, and increasingly a lot of that is refined.
Thank you. Just two
Simon.
quick questions.
What has super inspiring talk. The question I have is that Martha raised a very interesting question about micronutrient deficiency. In fact, one of the major statistics that I have come across, and basically with the climate change, is the major reductions in B vitamins, along with some minerals. And yet, across the globe, we are still really unsure in terms of the distribution. If you think along the lines of the sort of like using a unifying approach to look at our periodic tables, roughly about 80 or so, well, I mean, like roughly about 30 or so elements that define all human or all life on Earth, on planet Earth. And now in our body, we can measure at massay simultaneously roughly about 80 of them now with the technology. And yet we do not know how they are being distributed across all the living organism on Earth. And when we clearly know that climate change would change all of that. And one thing is like PM 2.5, and yet we do not know the composition of PM 2.5, but most likely would be all these elements in different compositions, like heavy metal, for example. And heavy metal pollution would be one major aspect of it with the climate change. So my point is that it seems to me that the first step before we talk about fortification is indeed make a really careful assessments of all these elemental level. For example, in blood, in urine, in our diet, across all the samples that we have, and see what that might be, and then potentially using a much more precise ways to do supplementation that might have some effect. And that's some of the works that we have been doing for the past 10 years, actually.
Yeah.
I just want you to comment on that, whether or not that sort of individual strategy, although it might be quote unquote traditionally in the public health thinking as a high risk approach for prevention, it's actually much more accessible moving forward, given the today's technology, as opposed to
Great question, but
right. So I just want Walter to think about whether opinion in terms of the individualistic, precision targeted approach as opposed to the public health population approach.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you raised a bunch of issues there. I think that issue about precision versus public health approach, I think we have to look carefully at what we can't generalize about that. And I do worry about over enthusiasm for precision medicine or precision medicine in particular, because it takes away the most important public health tools, which are things like policy, regulation, economic policies for subsidies or taxes that really make a huge difference. And we could spend a lot more money in trying to get precision for individuals that probably will have marginal benefits compared to broad policies like with smoking. We know that some people are more susceptible to tobacco smoke than others, but what really makes a difference are the policies and banning taxes, things like that. But in some instances, there may be some advantages to looking at more individualized solutions. But I think you make the point about we need better data for thinking about fortification policies. And I think one thing that became apparent the first time around with our planetary health analysis was that the data for the world on intake is dietary intakes is just very poor. Many countries, I think probably most countries, don't even have good survey data on a regular basis. And also, it would be really helpful to have more uniform monitoring of micronutrients. In fact, given that I did get a grant from Rockefeller Foundation that's really through Mahidol University in Thailand to set up as sort of a pilot, laboratory for nutrition surveillance where you could if you're a low-income country, don't have the resources to set up all the laboratories yourself, you could send your samples to Mahidol, and they would run a battery of nutrient-specific analyses, probably iron, some of the B vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin A, and have decent survey data from around the country. Very, very few countries actually have that micronutrient survey data to know what their people are really eating. So there needs to be, it doesn't have to be massive investment, but if there were half a dozen centers like this around the world where you could get high quality standardized data from survey samples, it would really move our whole field forward a lot. But still, given that, we can see huge benefits in real people in real time to shifting the diets that we can see right before our eyes. We don't have to wait. And we'll probably never know the health benefits of all the little minor micronutrients there. I think we probably don't need to know. Just even like we still don't know what really causes cancer from tobacco smoking.
one quick last question.
This is from the online audience from Joan Slavin. Great session today. Maha really causing issues, especially movement on seed oil and alternative sweeteners. Any thoughts on how to get folks at this meeting to get included in the Maha meetings?
Somehow there's a real echo up here.
How can we get the DNSG folks included in the Maha meetings? That's the question.
I don't know if you want to be in those meetings. It's well, I do, for example, the seed oil issue. I do have a pretty direct connection to people who are in those meetings, and I've sent them a review of the literature, and there's at least one person who has a pretty fixed idea of the truth in that meeting. And I'm not sure if anything else is going to matter. So I think it's really a precarious situation for public health, and we see the parallel situation for vaccine policy. Basically, the vaccine committee that CDC has had for decades of experts just got all fired, and they brought in people who are vaccine deniers. And to set regulations. Now, what physician is going to want to take guidance from that committee? And they've also basically, it looks like, thrown out the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report that was published a few months ago, and are coming up with their own guidelines that I'm told may be published within the next month. Yeah, so that process is already moving very fast, and it looks like it'll probably be a mix of things that may be good to do, but also things that don't make much sense at all. Yeah, I'm not sure you want to go there.
Thank you, Walter. Let us all thank Walter for a great